there's been this huge, reaction to the speech.
Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
He announced a new world order.
I believe the progress that we have made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order.
He acknowledged that middle powers in the West, Canada and European countries, have been going along with what he acknowledges an unjust and exploitative system.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false.
Within that same speech, he still talks about preserving the power of middle powers.
The middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
Canada, I'm very glad to see Carney making these comments, but will they take that step further?
The countries that have the most to lose from a world of fortresses and the most to gain from genuine cooperation.
What's up, guys? We're coming at you from my home here in Chongqing. I am here with Ben Norton, and we are going to react to what is unfolding with my Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, his visit to China, and more importantly, his speech at the World Economic Forum, what it means. This will be particularly interesting. We both live in China. I'm Canadian. Ben is an American. So we'll have an interesting perspective on it. It was, we see a lot of reaction to especially a speech at the World Economic Forum. And what was really interesting for us was an admission of wrongdoing, an admission of evil doing. But also, while his speech is encouraging about where we're headed, there's also no indication of correcting those wrongdoings and perhaps even hints of wrongdoings being continued. So without further ado, Ben, first of all, welcome.
Thanks for having me in your beautiful home, dude.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Let's get right into it. What is your reaction about what's unfolding?
Yeah, I think it's very significant. And if you look at social media, if you look at the mainstream media, there's been this huge, reaction to the speech, especially that Prime Minister Carney gave in Davos at the World Economic Forum. And this, of course, came just a few days after Carney came here to China and met with President Xi, and he announced a new world order is forming. So it has been two very important, very historic events. At the same time, I think it is rightful to call it, it's correct to call it historic, but some people may be going a bit far and saying this is the end of the West, it's the end of the U.S. global order. I think this is the beginning of a larger transition that's going to take a long time because, we'll talk more about the speech and what he said, but, even if Canada wanted immediately to just cut off ties with the U.S., it couldn't. This will be a gradual process. So 80% of Canada's exports go to the US. And yeah, Canada can try to reroute those exports to China, but one, a lot of the infrastructure doesn't even exist to do so. They have to, for instance, Canada is a major exporter of oil. They have to build new pipelines and infrastructure to actually get that crude over to China across the Pacific. So, this is important in the rhetoric and in the political intent of Canada to move away from the U.S. So let's kind of briefly talk about what was said. So Donald Trump, as president, has been openly threatening Canada, not so jokingly saying he wants to make Canada the 51st state. And when he first started talking about this, some people thought it was a joke, but increasingly it looks like it's not a joke. Trump now wants to colonize Greenland, which is an autonomous territory of Denmark, and Denmark is part of NATO. So there are threats of a war within NATO by the most powerful member. And of course, the U.S. attacked Venezuela and kidnapped its president. And the U.S. is threatening Mexico now, and Cuba and Colombia, many countries. That's not new, really. I mean, the U.S. has invaded many countries. But what is new is that now the U.S. was previously targeting global South countries, and now it's targeting its ostensible allies in Europe, in Canada. So Carney comes here to China and he says, we want to improve relations with Canada. It was the first trip by a Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade, in 9 years. And it came after, a horrible episode in Canada-China relations where Canada, at the behest of the US, basically kidnapped the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, who's the daughter of the founder of Huawei, the most important Chinese technology company. That was a huge blow to Canadian relations. And then, we have Carney comes, he says, we want to improve relations with you, we want to trade more with you, we want to diversify our relations. Then Carney goes to Davos, and he announces that Canada needs to diversify its relations and needs a new strategic orientation away from the US. That's all interesting, it's all important, but I think the real crux of what he said, probably the overlooks part, is he acknowledged that middle powers in the West, Canada and European countries, have been going along with what he acknowledges an unjust and exploitative system. He said the so-called rules-based international order was always deeply hypocritical, and Canada went along with it when it was convenient.
Exactly.
For Canada.
And
it no longer is.
And the other thing too is that when he acknowledges that middle powers have benefited from this unfair system, within that same speech, he still talks about preserving the power of middle powers.
The middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
So it wasn't middle powers that were affected by Canada playing along with this unfair system. It was mostly the global south that was affected. And he doesn't even want to bring the global south into this fold when he's talking about we really need to do something. Once again, it's preserving those middle powers that benefited from it. So it would be very difficult for anybody to look at this in a virtuous way when, A, the catalyst for this is going from the table to the menu. And B, even when he is on the menu, he's like, let's bring everybody into this and find a way to survive, including our victims, including, they did nothing for the Palestinians also, and even went along with what the U.S., a lot of the U.S.'s rhetoric. So it is extremely hypocritical, isn't it? And it's definitely not virtuous.
Yeah, well, we can play a clip. In this speech, he said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So, this is an incredible statement by the sitting leader of a major country. And here, I'm going to flip the split.
Yeah, go ahead.
And we can play the split. And he also said, this is exactly what he said.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful. We participated in the rituals. And we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works.
So that is such a revealing admission there. He says, this was useful, but the bargain no longer works. So what is the bargain? The bargain is the U.S. is the hegemon. The U.S. is the most powerful country. Wall Street benefits, the military-industrial complex benefits, Silicon Valley benefits, and the middle powers get their cut, right? If you're a mob boss, the Don, the head of the mafia, gets most of it, but then, he pays his cronies a little bit. They all get a cut, which is why they're all incentivized to go along with the system. So this is the leader of Canada saying, the U.S. has been waging war in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and Libya and Syria, now Iran. They've been overseeing horrible colonial crimes in Palestine and all of this. And Canada and the middle powers went along with it because the bargain was they would get some benefits.
Right.
The U.S. would get most, they would get their cut. And now they no longer are getting their cut. It's no longer useful, which is why suddenly they are upholding the idea that we must defend international law, we must defend sovereignty. What about the sovereignty of the Palestinians? It's also important to juxtapose what Carney has been saying with a message that France's president, Emmanuel Macron, sent to Trump. He sent him a text message. Trump posted it. According to Trump, this is a text message from Macron. And he said, look, Trump, look, Donald, you and I agree on Iran and Syria. Let's work together on Iran and Syria. Where we disagree is on Greenland. So this is also the same message. The message is, why are we not teaming up against the global south?
Right.
The whole deal was, none of us challenges you. You're the boss. The U.S. is the boss, and we're your partners in crime. We're below you, but we're also part of the same club. And we, exploit the global south. That was the whole deal. And now you're going against us too. So, for me, it's just the ultimate example of this hypocrisy, which is that they were fine in participating in this exploitation, but now that they're victims of that exploitation, and they had a glimpse at what it feels like to be in the global south. Now, it's nothing like what has happened to people in Gaza or has happened to people in Syria and Venezuela. Like, obviously, they haven't been bombed yet, they haven't had sanctions imposed on them yet. Of course, that could potentially happen. In fact, I saw a report in the Globe and Mail, Canadian newspaper, that shows that the Canadian military is now making potential plans for a U.S. invasion. Of course, this is only a possibility, and they don't think it's necessarily likely, but who knows if it could happen. And so they have to create like guerrilla warfare tactics, unconventional warfare, because obviously when you have a population of 40 billion versus 350,
They have to learn from Afghanistan.
so they're studying the tactics used in Afghanistan. That is crazy.
It is, it is. And by saying this bargain no longer works, also leaves some hints that if all of a sudden somebody else comes along and starts undoing this stuff, they'll jump back in. They'll jump back into this unfair system that they benefit from. And but is there in some ways, I look at the hypocrisy of his speech, and it's really funny. But on the other hand, as a Canadian, I'm really happy to see this being broken up a bit. I mean, we were destined to become as pathetic as the Australians politically. Sorry, my Aussie friends, but Australia is the ultimate U.S. client state,
Yeah.
and we weren't far behind. So I'm happy to see that broken up. And actually, I showed you the message. The most important VIP endorsement I've ever received was from my mother, where she sent me a message yesterday. And she said, when you told me you really wanted Donald Trump to win because he would mess things up in such a way that Canada would be forced to diversify, I thought you were crazy. But it turns out you were right.
So still, let's just hope he's not serious about actually annexing Canada.
Right, yeah. That would be one step too far. And I would have never predicted that would have been a legitimate threat. But, but obviously there is a chance that the U.S. will use economic force to cause Canada to capitulate back. But is there anything positive we can take away from it as people who are concerned about the global south in terms of still seeing this system somewhat being disrupted and broken up?
Definitely. I mean, this is a very important and historic development, and it's a positive development. It's very good seeing these middle powers break away from this imperialist system. I mean, this is how imperialism works, is that the U.S. is at the head of the system. And even within the core countries of the what they call the world system of the empire, the core countries, the wealthiest, most advanced countries, there's still a hierarchy. And the U.S. is now saying that they no longer see, these junior partners in crime as significant and as providing the U.S. sufficient benefit, right? Because the deal was the U.S. allows the middle powers, European countries, Canada, Australia, even though they are in this subordinated relationship, it allows them to share some of the spoils of war, right? So to make an analogy to 1,000 years ago, you have the emperor and a feudal system, and you have the feudal lords, right? They also get some benefit. And as long as they get some benefit, they're incentivized to support the feudal system and not to rebel against the king. But now the king is saying, represented by Donald Trump, but it's not just Trump. You can see kind of cracks in this order going back a decade or two, right? A lot of it goes back to the 2008 financial crisis, where part of this whole deal was the U.S. is the anchor of the global economy, the dollar is the heart of the global financial system, and Wall Street is really the center of that system. And other countries, they have their own financial systems. Mark Carney himself being a huge beneficiary of that. Carney is a banker. He worked for Goldman Sachs on Wall Street. Then he was a central banker. He was the head of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. So he understands that system very well. And again, it's like the feudal lords get some of the wealth. They share some of the benefits. But now the emperor, the king, is saying, no, I want everything, 100%. And he abandons the feudal lords. So then some of the feudal lords decide we should turn against the king and we should go find some other allies. That's, of course, a good thing. But at the same time, it doesn't excuse the feudal lords and all the ways that they oppressed the peasantry, the serfs, right? So in this case, I mean, the world really needs an alternative. This is why we've seen so many attempts to create, a more multipolar world through organizations like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This goes back to the non-aligned movement founded in 1961. And it's good to see some of these middle powers taking kind of more non-aligned position. But at the same time, I begin our analysis today emphasizing that I think some people are saying they're going a step too far and concluding this is the end. Like, the system is collapsing. I would say this is maybe the beginning of the end, but it's still the beginning because you mentioned that there are so many ways this could go. One, Western politicians love to say things, but rhetoric is not action. So we'll see what Carney's action is. Again, I acknowledge at the beginning that he's kind of constrained in what he can do, given that Canada is extremely economically dependent on the U.S. He actually acknowledged that in his speech. He said that when dependency is used as a tool of subordination, you have to change your ways. So he's acknowledging that Canada economically is so dependent on the U.S., 80%, again, think about that, 80% of its exports go to the U.S., which means that by the U.S. putting tariffs on Canada, that is devastating to the Canadian economy. Mexico's in a similar situation. Now, Mexico has been more not aligned than Canada, but even Mexico, what it can do, its options are limited. So there is a possibility that we see this kind of gradual transition. Canada trades more with China, diversifies its relations. That's the ideal scenario. But there are a few other scenarios. One, Trump responds with even greater threats and Carney capitulates. Another option is Carney tries to transition a bit, and then you get another leader comes into power, maybe a conservative, like a Harper-style conservative who's very pro-U.S., and he just undoes.
But Harper's agreeing with what Carney's doing also.
Well, that's what he says, because at this point, in Canada, public opinion of the U.S. is so low. I recently saw a poll that showed that public opinion of the U.S. and Canada is at the lowest point ever. And it's about 1/3 of Canadians have a positive view of the U.S. and 2/3 of a negative view, which is incredible when you think about that massive shift. But it's pretty partisan. So when Biden was president, suddenly it flipped and they had a positive view. Although when Biden was president, public opinion in Canada did fall. But, at this point, the Conservative Party was going to win the last election. I mean, you know this very well. Like, look at the polls. The Conservatives were leading by a wide margin. Trudeau was very unpopular. Okay. And then Trump started saying, we're going to take over Canada. We're going to annex that 51st state. And then in the span of a few weeks, the Conservatives' support collapsed and the Liberals won. So these things can switch pretty rapidly. And Harper, I think, recognized that in this historical moment, he can't be seen as pro-Trump because Trump is so hated by Canadians. And it's a matter of national respect. But if one of his allies from the Conservatives came into power, it's a very real possibility that they could,
Did you see Harper's video where he was talking about it?
Yeah.
Because he said he even advised the government to specifically do this. I mean, it still could be all for show. It doesn't exclude that as a possibility.
Even what Carney's saying could be for show. I mean,
well, he's removed or reduced the EV tariffs. Yeah. So there is sign. I mean, it's a small concession.
Yeah.
There is evidence that they are taking action.
Yeah. To diversify and to grow a little closer, to move a little closer to China, which is a good thing. But at the same time, again, we'll see. Honestly, I'm not a fan of Carney. I'm very glad he said this. I mean, honestly, it makes me kind of like him a little bit. I'm not still very skeptical of him. But even if he really, even if politically, I think if he were better, I should think it would be very difficult. Because, like I said, this is going to be a gradual process. It's going to have to transition. Because it's not just the politics of it, the economics of it. The Canadian U.S. economies are so deeply integrated that, decoupling in that way is going to take a long time.
Are you surprised that he came out with a speech and that he was, verbally at least, so forceful about it? Because when you look at these wake-up calls that other American allies are receiving now, they're not really doing anything with it. They're still kind of just meekly, they're kind of just cowering in a corner, more or less. Are you surprised by what Carney said and what he's doing?
Yeah, I am. I mean, this, of course, came after his trip to China. I was also very surprised to see he met with President Xi and he announced a new world order, which that's really big. And let's not forget, sometimes when people say the world order, they think it's like some stupid conspiracy. Yeah, actually, this term really goes back to George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., who was people jokingly call him, not so jokingly call him, the king of the deep state. He was the head of the CIA. And he was involved in crazy Texas oil politics. So George Bush Sr., when he became president, he this was right when the Soviet Union was overthrown. It was the end of the first Cold War. And Bush Sr. announced what he called a new world order. And that meant the U.S.-dominated imperialist system, the unipolar order that has been dying for the past decade or two. This was, I think he gave a speech, right after the Soviet Union was overthrown. So now what we're saying is basically Carney is saying this is the multipolar order, right? If you want to find a good historical moment, you have the overthrow of the Soviet Union, that's the unipolar order. Now the Canadian Prime Minister says, we're in a new world order. That's a clear sign Canada's trying to take advantage of this multipolar order, right? This is the good thing about multipolar system for smaller and medium-sized countries. They don't want to be on the menu. They want to be at the table. They want to have partnerships and work non-aligned foreign policy. Whereas the U.S. right now, it's trying to move back to this kind of sphere of influence, like this colonial division of the world, where the U.S. controls the entire Western Hemisphere, including Canada, which means that Canada must surrender its sovereignty. So it's only logical that a sovereign Canadian government would take this position, but I honestly did not expect that to happen. So I am impressed. But you look at Europe. Europe's been talking about this for over a decade. This is why I'm still a little skeptical. I'm happy.
Not so forcefully, though. Not as...
It's true. Yeah, it's true. But I remember when Trump was elected first time, and Angela Merkel in Germany, who was at least kind of like Carney, she was much more committed to what she called strategic autonomy. She and Macron, who is still president of FN, he won't go away, they were talking about making a European standing army. And they recognized that the U.S. was no longer a reliable partner. And there's this famous photo of Donald Trump sitting down at the table and all of these Europeans yelling at him. And that was almost 10 years ago now. What has Europe done? I look at Europe, I think Europe is even more subordinated to the U.S. today than it was 10 years ago when they started talking about strategic autonomy and a pan-European standing army. So maybe this is the breaking point, because now the U.S. is saying we're going to colonize Greenland, which is technically a Danish territory, even though even that politics is also complicated, right? Because the people of Greenland who are indigenous, they've been pushing for independence from Greenland from Denmark for a long time. But now they're in this horrible situation where they didn't want independence from Denmark and they wanted sovereignty, but they don't want to be taken over by the U.S. A poll from last year found that 85% of people in Greenland do not want to join the U.S. And that figure has likely increased since then. So we're talking about almost everyone in Greenland opposes this, and yet the U.S. still wants to do it. So maybe this could be a breaking point. We've even seen now in the past few days in the Western financial press, more and more discussion of financial weapons that the Europeans have. This is a really big deal. Because the dollar is the global reserve currency, and the U.S. has been running these massive deficits with the rest of the world, which you call Kernicon deficit. The U.S. imports, and it exports dollars and debt. It sells treasury securities. What we've seen is that Europe is now holding trillions of dollars of U.S. government debt, treasury securities, including about 20% of all of the treasury securities that are held abroad. And furthermore, Europeans hold trillions of dollars of U.S. stocks, of equities in U.S. publicly listed companies. So now some European officials and media outlets are saying that they're considering selling those assets. They could tank the U.S. stock market, which would also not only hurt, billionaires and rich people in the U.S. because 90% of stocks are owned by about 10% of the population, but also because the U.S. government relies very heavily on tax revenue that are from capital gains taxes on stock market. So there's this perverse relationship where if the U.S. stock market goes down, U.S. Receipts from tax receipts go down, which means that if the U.S. government deficit stays the same, if the stock market crashes, U.S. debt will continue to rise as a percentage of GDP, and it's already 120% of GDP. So that's one instrument, that's one option that Europe has. And then the other is selling U.S. government debt, U.S. Treasury securities, which would cause bond yields to rise. It would also significantly, it would cause the price of current existing Treasury securities in the bond market to collapse. which means that people who hold on to those treasuries would be incentivized to sell them further, which only pushes up bond yields more at a time when U.S. government debt's very high. So there are options that Europe has, and they're talking about using those options. But again, talking is one thing. We'll see if they actually do it. And this is why, again, Canada, I'm very glad to see Carney making these comments, but will they take that step further? And will Canada and the Europeans actually put their money where their mouth is?
Do you think that Carney's reaction and speech and what he's doing could also act as an incentive or act as encouragement for some more of these middle powers to start coming out with a bit more strong language, or even perhaps really seriously consider using some of these financial tools at their disposal?
I hope so. I really do. Again, we talked about the hypocrisy of it all. And of course, many people in the global south, they're very rightful to be deeply skeptical and not trust Canada and not trust the middle powers. At the same time, I mean, this is a good thing. Like, if you're being oppressed by a group of people and they start fighting, you should encourage that infighting. It's good for you because then they're going to stop oppressing you, right? So, I hope that's what happens. And honestly, it would be good for Canada and it would be good for the people of Europe, right? Because we talk about how this system, as it's been designed, really since the beginning of the 1990s. You can go back further, of course, but that was really, when this unipolar moment emerged. Because, you look back at the first Cold War, and Europe, of course, was allied with the US, and Canada was allied with the US. But honestly, they were still a little more independent. Europe traded with the Soviet Union. Famously, many European countries imported Soviet oil and gas, which was a huge issue of contention. Anthony Blinken, the former U.S. Secretary of State under Biden, he wrote his master's thesis on the geopolitics of the pipelines in Europe, sending Soviet gas to Western Europe. And then, of course, he was Secretary of State when Nord Stream was blown up, which is very funny. I mean, it's a very similar historical episode. But this is obviously something that the U.S. was angry about then, but Europe said, we're independent. And we're your ally, but we're not your puppet, we're not your vassal. And Canada is another interesting example. After the Chinese Revolution, the U.S. put an embargo on China, and Canada did not.
Right.
Another example is Canada always had good relations with Cuba.
Yeah.
So even during the height of the first Cold War, I think actually these middle powers were more independent than they are today. It's really when the Soviet Union was overthrown and the U.S. became the global hegemon in the unipolar era. That's when these Western leaders just totally subordinated themselves. And there was a little pushback in 2003, for instance. France and Germany opposed the invasion of Iraq, although many Western countries did join the invasion of Iraq, especially the UK.
Yeah.
But, we saw some pushback from some European powers. That was 23 years ago now. Here we are in the past decade. They haven't done anything to push back against the U.S. This is the first time you've really seen serious discussions. So I think that's something that's very welcome.
If these middle powers band together and they try to diversify from the U.S., even though the global south, the countries that had the unfair end of the deal that everybody was happy to follow, even though they are not in their consideration to say, we're going to reconcile this and bring everybody into the fold. Once again, Carney was clear, this is about preserving the power of middle powers. Is, though, the result of that, the side effect of that it will create a more fair world for the global south, because these middle powers who are sitting in the middle between these two groups are creating systems to diversify from the U.S. Do you know what I mean?
It's not automatic, but it definitely provides the opportunity. And these countries that are global south have to work together and build those kinds of alternative opportunities. So in the case of these middle powers like Europe and in Canada, seeking to diversify their relations, of course, the obvious option is trading more with China and improving relations with China. China is the world's biggest economy when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. It's about 20% the entire world's economy, whereas the US is about 14% and falling over time. So that's obvious. But there are many other big countries that also could be potential partners in terms of trade and investment, but also working together politically and diplomatically. Of course, India, a massive country, the most populous country, 1.4 billion people. You also have big global south countries that are growing fast. Brazil, Indonesia, so Turkey. So I think, Turkey's always been this kind of middle power that hedges, that plays both sides when it serves its interests, right? So if we do see, these Western countries, if you can still call it the West, Canada, Europe, even maybe Australia, if they do try to hedge and improve their relations with other parts of the global south, that could be good, right? So for instance, we've also seen a recent breakthrough in discussions between the EU and Mercosur, which is a South American trade bloc. And they've been discussing for years and years potential opportunities to make a free trade agreement between Europe, the EU, and South America. And there are disadvantages and advantages to that, but they apparently have had a major breakthrough on this. And that would be a significant way to reduce their dependence on trade with the US. Because the way this system has worked, we talk about, imperialism, and it's not just a matter of like invading countries and carrying out regime change operations and coups. That's a big part of imperialism. But another part of imperialism is, again, if you look at the global economy, the world system, you can see that it's divided in this hierarchy. So you have the very wealthy advanced countries in the core, and then you have the more exploited, underdeveloped countries in the periphery. And what we've seen historically is that when the U.S. created the dollar system we know about today, where the dollar became the global reserve currency, the U.S. began to suck in all of the surpluses of all of the countries around the world that actually produce things, especially in, peripheral, semi-peripheral economies like China. So U.S. companies would offshore, and they would make factories in places like China and other parts of the global south, exploit low-paid labor, and then people in these countries, they would only see a fraction of the profits, and then the vast majority of the profits would go back to the core, back to the intellectual property holders. And that's why it was advantageous. The companies in the U.S., yes, it has hurt the U.S. because of deindustrialization and the loss of manufacturing jobs, but they still made the vast majority of the profits. And what we're now seeing is that some of these middle powers are saying, okay, maybe we should change this system, and instead of everything revolving around the U.S., we could try to diversify our trade relationships. But then also they want to kind of replicate that, and they want to be the ones who benefit from this unfair relationship with the global south. So again, it's not guaranteed, right? It's a better system because global south countries don't want to replace one oppressor with another oppressor. Right. However, that said, I will say that these middle powers, because they're middle powers, they're actually in many ways not much stronger than some of the big global south countries. Like, look at Canada. Canada is a very wealthy country, has a lot of natural resources, but it's a population of around, 40 million people. Look at Brazil. Brazil is a country with more than 200 million people, and it's one of the biggest economies. Now, per capita, of course, living standards of Brazilians are much lower, and per capita GDP is much lower. But when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to global influence and leverage in trade negotiations, Brazil is probably more powerful than Canada. And so we're also coming into an interesting moment where these Western middle powers are in many ways weaker than some of the global south powers like India, certainly, or like Indonesia, these up-and-coming, fast-growing economies. So again, I think what we're also seeing is that these Western middle powers, it's not only a response to Donald Trump. Keep emphasizing this, that in my videos, I often emphasize that Trump is not responsible for everything that we're seeing in the world, but he's the one who really is pulling off the Band-Aid very quickly, right? Like, these are problems that have been festering for a long time, and Trump is accelerating the transition toward an even more multipolar world. But we've seen this happening already for decades.
Right, yeah. So definitely there is a chance that these middle powers could still band together to say, well, now we're going to take over this exploitation, and we're going to continue with it.
So what I'm saying, I don't think that will be very easy.
Yeah, it'll be quite a bit more difficult. But even if they try to do that, in the process of creating off-ramps from the U.S., other people could use those off-ramps also, those alternative systems. I mean, I remember when Donald Trump walked away from the JCPOA with Iran, he basically canceled the contract that they had. And European banks, European suppliers, European companies still wanted to continue following the deal. but they were forced to abandon it also and would have faced sanctions if they had not agreed to also terminate that deal. During that period of time, I believe they tried to create an alternative system outside of SWIFT.
They did. It was Intex or an Instex.
Instex, that's it.
But you know how many transactions they did?
Not many.
None.
Oh, none. Zero.
And they did some test transactions, but it was never used, and then they shut it down.
Right.
Like, this is the point I'm getting at, is that they've been talking about this for a long time. They went through all this effort over years to create this parallel system, and they never used it, and they shut it down.
Right.
But this could be different. They keep saying that this time's different. Maybe it really is.
But the other thing that could potentially happen is if these middle powers all of a sudden go out in an outright offensive against the U.S., and the U.S. is occupied with trying to recontrol these middle power allies who are, always happy to be subjugated by the U.S. It gives the global south an opportunity to band together and start coming up with all their own solutions while the U.S. is distracted with this other problem.
Of course, and this is what they've been doing through organizations like BRICS.
Yeah.
And Western critics love to say that BRICS is a talking shop, as if the European Union is not a talking shop. But actually, I mean, BRICS has been slowly kind of building, people say, building the bricks of this new road, pun intended. And what we've seen now is that it's become clear, even to these Western middle powers, why that is so necessary, why organizations like BRICS are necessary. And, when you were talking there about how could potentially be a good thing, look, I'll make a kind of extreme analogy, but as horrible, and I want to be clear here, I'm not saying we should go back to this, but as horrible as World War I and World War II were, over 100 million dead from both of these wars. Just absolutely horrible. Again, to clarify, I don't want to go back to that in any way, but think about it from the perspective of the Global South. Just being realistic for a second. In World War I, all of the imperial powers started fighting each other, and it was totally unnecessary. It was an inter-imperialist war, but that meant that a lot of countries in the Global South that were colonized were able to organize against the colonizers. And then in World War II, you see the collapse of the European empires. I hope it doesn't take that level of bloodshed, but decolonization movements had gone on for hundreds of years. Look at India. There were people resisting British colonialism for all of the history, for 200 years of British colonialism. They were only successful in 1947 because the British Empire was destroyed by World War II by fighting the German Empire and the Japanese Empire, like these empires all fighting together, right? It's not a coincidence that you see a massive wave of decolonization movements in the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. This is the peak of the national liberation struggles when the European empires were destroyed and the Western powers were, at each other's throats. Again, I hope we don't have to go back to that kind of world war, but the point I'm getting at is that when these imperialist powers are fighting with each other, they can take their boot off when you're in a fight, you have to take your boot off the person you're oppressing to kick the other person. Well, finally, the boot's off their neck at least.
Well, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to lead to a hot conflict in order for that to happen. Even the soft conflict between these middle powers with America could create that opportunity, couldn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah. No.
And this is why I'll add a quick note. I would not be surprised to see, we've seen this in Europe a little bit, to see countries like Canada and some other European countries now suddenly start to criticize some of the U.S. wars and, for instance, support Palestinians. Because as Mark Carney said, they always knew that this so-called rules-based international order in which the West makes the rules and orders everyone around, they always knew it was hypocritical. Mark Carney pointed out that, for instance, that the financial system was always asymmetrical. Some powers benefited more, primarily the U.S. He would know that as someone working in Wall Street. He pointed out that, international law was not consistently applied. It depended on the identity of the country. So the U.S. invaded Iraq, no consequences. Then Russia has the war in Ukraine, and suddenly Europe says, violation of the UN Charter and everything. Well, what about the U.S.? What were you doing for the past 20 years? You were supporting these U.S. wars. Some of Europe, to be fair to all of it. But I would not be surprised now. And then, of course, Palestine is just the most egregious example. Like, you mentioned Canada. Even under Trudeau, who's, of course, a liberal from the same party as Carney, although Carney seems to be much better politically, we've seen that in the past few years, Canada was actually voting against, they don't have veto power, voting against resolutions in the UN along with the US that almost the entire world supported on Palestine. So Canada was actually isolating itself. And now I will not be surprised to see Canada follow like what Spain has been doing, and certainly Ireland. You know, Ireland has its own history with British colonialism, right? But we've seen a few European countries kind of break away on the issue of Palestine and support Palestine. So I would not be surprised that now Canada suddenly, you know, to poke the US and say, okay, well, we're gonna actually call out your hypocrisy publicly. We're gonna criticize your attacks on Gaza and your attack on Iran. Maybe they want to do that. That's the real question. Like, if the US bombs Iran again, which it looks like they're talking about, will Canada condemn that? Will Europe condemn that?
And if they do, and I mean, it just goes to show how cowardly and submissive they were the whole time, that they were just following along.
To point this benefit, as Carney said.
And I think this is an important lesson for the global South too, who may be celebrating what Carney did. I grew up in Canada with this idea that we Canadians are friendly, we're a friendly nation, we're virtuous, and that may be true for a lot of people.
As a people,
there's plenty of people who are concerned about the global South in Canada, but the global South should be aware that the Canadian government is not your friend. And that was even evident by his speech. There's no attempt to reconcile the people who are on the losing end of that deal that Canada was willing to follow for so long when it benefited themselves. And at a moment's notice, as soon as Canada can benefit from that system again, they'll be back in it. I don't think there can be enough pressure I don't think the government's actually representing their people in these countries. And the people won't be able to either pressure their government to do the right thing or even potentially recognize that they're not doing the right thing. Because I think a lot of Canadians are happy with what Carney said, but are perhaps not picking up on the nuances of what it actually, how it actually implicates Canada and how it actually shows where their true values and concerns are. It's not the global South.
yeah,
It's with still preserving power however they can.
I agree 100% with you. But the point that I was making is that they might not have the option. Because this is the point I often make is when you look back at the first Cold War, most of the world was not part of that Cold War. At least they didn't want to be part of it. They were kind of forced to be, but they were part of the non-aligned movement. So if you look at the founding members of the non-aligned movement, you had India, the most populous country, Egypt, the most populous Arab majority country. You also had Indonesia, the most populous Southeast Asian country. These are massive countries. Ghana, another major African country. And then most of the global South joined the non-aligned movement. And even a few European countries like Yugoslavia. So there's always been this interest in non-alignment and refusing to like pick a side in this Cold War and to simply do what's in your own national interest. That's not new. What is new is that when the non-aligned movement was formed in 1961, those countries like Indonesia, Egypt, Ghana, they were very weak. India, they were still relatively very weak. They had just achieved independence from European colonialism. They were just trying to develop. It's very different today. I mentioned that you look at some of these, developing countries like Indonesia, Brazil, even India, they have made a lot of progress. They still have a long way to go, but it means that not only militarily and such, but economically, they actually have more power and cannot be bullied as effectively as they could have been 6 years ago. So this is, again, why the new multipolar reality of the world may force countries like Canada and other middle powers in the West, it may force them to have better relations, more respectful, amicable relations with the global South, simply because of this whole idea, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. A lot of global South countries see it the same way, and they also want to be at the table. So they will not allow Canada to dictate terms to them. They will accept mutually advantageous, mutually beneficial terms. So I think that this could potentially lead to a much more equitable global order when Carney talked about a new world order, not because of his benevolence and because the Canadian government has good intentions, but because it's not powerful enough to extract concessions from countries that were much weaker 60 years ago.
Right. But to my point also, while the global South is being approached by Canada, they have to keep in the back of their minds that as soon as Canada is invited back to the big boy table, they very may well take that opportunity. It would not be in their best interest, and I'm hoping that even if they have an opportunity to join the table again with the U.S., this has been an irreversible lesson where they say that this is still a position of vulnerability that they shouldn't be in, even if they're being invited back to that table. Are the leaders of Canada intelligent enough to recognize that when they're being given a golden pass back into the dining room where they're not on the menu? I don't know, but at least there's a chance, and it's good to see this disruption happening.
Yeah, well, one quick note. I mean, when Trump was president the first time, we started seeing his rhetoric from Western officials. Again, in Europe, they were talking about strategic autonomy, and yet they've become less strategic and less autonomous since then. And then when Biden became president, a lot of these governments just went back to the way things were before. And
Right.
just obediently did what Washington wanted because they saw it as corresponding with their own interests. And now Trump's president the second time, and some of them are saying we have to change, this time's different. Well, what if Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, is the next president, and he comes in and he says, don't worry, Trump was an anomaly. That was a horrible 4 years, but we're back. The rules-based order, we're going to save it, and everything is going to go back to the way it was before. I would not be surprised to see, certainly, a liberal government in Canada go along with that.
Yeah.
I think Carney will probably still be prime minister by the time there is a new U.S. presidential election. So we'll see. But I will say that this time actually could be different because the U.S. is talking about colonizing territory belonging to a European country.
Right.
That's what is different. That's the whole point of this is they say, we were fine with you attacking global south countries and all that, but you attacked us. That's not tolerable. So the question is, when Biden came in, he didn't reverse most of Trump's policies. Trump moved the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv, which is the internationally recognized de facto capital, to Jerusalem, which is occupied according to international law. It's illegal. Biden didn't move that embassy. He talked about the rules-based order. He didn't care. Trump put all of these tariffs on China. Biden, not only did he not lift the tariffs, he put more tariffs on China. So we'll see what actually happens. It's possible that a Democrat could come in the U.S. in a few years and try to reverse this and try to save this system. It might be too late. Or it's possible that even if someone like that does come in the U.S., a Gavin Newsom-style figure, he cannot save that system. It's gone.
Right.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, let's circle back once we see what the retaliatory measures are from the U.S., and we'll do a follow-up in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, thanks, Daniel.
Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
See you guys next time.